So there's the dilemma. I want to think about the scriptures from the perspective of their original readers and authors, but I'm in this post-enlightenment, rational, materialistic world, and even modern, postmodern world, and thousands of years of theology and philosophy added on to my interpretation of scripture. So it's like, how in the world do I escape that? So you combine that realization with another fact, which I came to terms with, which is that I don't understand a lot of things in the Bible. Like, I grew up reading the Bible. I read it probably like 10 times since becoming a believer again. And it's like I get the theology, like I get the stories, I can explain like our traditional, orthodox or whatever interpretation of most of it. But there are so many things that I just read and I'm like, I don't even know what they're saying. Like they're using entirely different language and concepts. For example, like and it can be little things or it can be like entire scenarios, entire stories. Um, like we were just talking earlier with my family about the Nazarite vow. Like it's like okay, there's some vow that you take and like makes you special or whatever. But like, what is that? Why is it the hair? Why wine? Giving up grapes. Like what does that mean? And in the New Testament, like the light of the eye. Like if the light of your eye be dark, how great is that darkness? Like there there's no interpretive framework that explains that other than kind of a scholarly approach of like what would they have understood that to mean. You can take the scholarly route and try to find extra biblical sources or primary documents to kind of explain to you what was meant by that. But it's really a completely different worldview that those things are within. Like, it didn't need to be explained to them because that is how they viewed the world. And this is kind of another dilemma is that when you approach that, you start to realize that, like, well, it's not rational. It's not a, a accurate materialistic explanation of the world. So does that mean it's wrong? Flat Earth is a perfect example because there, if you read it plainly, as though it were a precise material explanation of the world, that is the Bible. That's what you get. And so people trying in sincerity to be consistent just accept that that is the accurate material explanation for reality and everything else is a lie. Anything NASA does or says is just a conspiracy to bury the truth because it reveals God's design, let's say. Like it reveals his, uh, how should I put this? So the globe and millions of years and evolution and all these are like the enemy's attempt to undermine scripture, and it's all fake. It's all just made up in order to do that. Um, because if the world was flat and covered by a dome, then everyone would realize like it's not science, it's not like quantifiable things and laws. It's God literally like holding the sun and the moon in the air. They're just floating up there, spinning around. And, the, the heavens are literally holding back waters. And that's in sincerity how they, and there are some flat earthers that aren't Christian. And I don't know, they're just taking it as though any ancient cosmology is the true one, and that there's the modern one, which is fake or whatever. So does that mean it's not true if it's not an accurate physical representation of the world? So there's this other view that's neither hyper literal or just everything's metaphor, because that's one way you could explain it. It's like, well, it's just metaphor. And that third way, the middle way, I believe, is the symbolic view, where that doesn't mean, like when I say the Bible is symbolic, it doesn't mean that it's just stories invented to say something. But it does mean that the stories have meaning. And that's the fundamental difference between the two worldviews, which I believe is like the ancient biblical worldview and the modern worldview. In the modern worldview, nothing has meaning. And you see this played out in postmodernism and different philosophical frameworks where, like, uh, nothing has meaning. We only assign meaning. It's like, okay, like if you're gonna be a materialist, that is the conclusion, is that nothing has meaning. So they're being consistent. And that results in absurdity. It results in essentially nihilism. It's like that's the end result. And you can tell that to a rational atheistic type, and they're like, well, that's just rhetoric. Like, I'm not a nihilist, I'm an atheist. I have values, and it's like, okay, well, the thing is, you're just not being consistent. It's like, no one said you can't have morals. It's like, it's just you're not being consistent with your worldview. That's the problem. You've created a subjective morality, and you're just going to act like that is the way things should be. And like that's the point. It's like you are behaving as though there was meaning. So the hyper-rational types have a problem with the Bible for many reasons, but one being like, well, why didn't God tell us about germ theory? Why are his descriptions of things not scientifically accurate? And there's a problem on the hyper-symbolic side too. And I think this is closer to where ancient people were, but there's also value in the way that they interpreted reality, where we see this in the New Testament. Why was this man born blind? Who sinned, him or his parents? And I think there's a whole theological conversation that that's referring to. But that kind of tells you about their thinking, is like there's connections between everything that we observe and like a spiritual reality, which is true to a degree. And I think there is a balance between them. And like to, it's important that we progressed as society became more rational and scientific, because the symbolic view tends to break down when you look at minute or precise physical laws, properties, etc. So does that mean it's false? No. It's like, well, no, because those facts, those things that we get from science, they don't mean anything. So they don't have any practical implication or value in terms of what we use to understand society or spirituality, like anything that goes on internally or subjectively. It doesn't have any connection to that. Now, there's cognitive, like science and science of the brain and things like you can kind of approach that, and then there's psychology, of course. But the symbolic view is a worldview, like, and it appears true in many ways. And that's true with a capital T, because it's like truth in that way only exists in the truth like that only exists in the realm of meaning, in the realm of experience, perspective. And as far as like science is concerned, that's all subjective. That's what we try to eliminate. It's like, but we need both because we're human beings and we need both. It's like there's an extreme end to both of these, and I think there's a balance, which um, ironically it took Christians, like the Protestant work ethic and the Christian way of believing in an understandable reality and um, a God that ordered things such that they can be understood rationally. Uh, but then that taken to its own extreme conclusion, like thinking about the world exclusively in those terms leads you away from God. So it's like we took this move toward understanding the natural world, and then we just continued with that. But there's like this place that exists in between them. But to get between them and away from where we currently are, which is way over here, like we have to understand the way that they thought in ancient times. And that way of viewing things is the way that the Bible speaks. So that's where it's most important to understand. But it's not just a hermeneutic. Like it's not just a way to interpret the Bible. It is a worldview. Like it's a framework by which you interpret reality itself. And that is very difficult to wrap your mind around as a rational person. Like, how do you view the world without like science and rational thinking and logic? It's not that they didn't have logic, it's that they had a completely different way of thinking about truth. But one way we can find that kind of truth, as Jonathan Pajot frequently mentions, is that it's true. If something is true, it's true on multiple levels. And I'm very new to this way of thinking, so it's hard to even describe or provide examples. Any examples that I'm thinking of have theological implications, so I don't want to go there yet. Light. What is light? So, so light. Light is a good example. I always go back to this one. So, in a scientific, rational, materialistic way of understanding the world, light is electromagnetic radiation, photons. It's things that you can measure. If we had, you know, if we had the tools to do it, we could see photons, like we can measure the frequency of the light. It's a form of energy that is emitted by certain reactions, that kind of thing. So while that is an accurate description of light, doesn't really mean, but an ancient person's perspective of light is that it's provided by luminaries. objects in heaven which project light to us that allow us to see. And fire also does it, but that's essentially the only places light comes from. It's like the sky stuff, those things up there, or fire. It causes you to be able to see. It it's analogous to understanding. And we use our speech is so heavily embedded in this kind of symbolic framework that we just talk about it in that way without even realizing. We say it's like the Enlightenment, even. It's like what does understanding things in a rational way have to do with light? It's like, well, materially speaking, like virtually nothing other than that you need light to see things. But that's not what it means. It's like enlightening of the eyes. Like when light is cast on something, you are able to observe it. You are able to perceive and understand it. That's all metaphorical, symbolic connection between light and thought. Because a blind person is perfectly capable of thinking rationally, logically, of understanding the world around them. It has nothing to do with light or being able to see light, but that's the way that we talk about it because it means something symbolically, but it's also true. That doesn't mean it's not true in the real world, but this is where it breaks down, is like when you look at something, the way I talk about it is when you look at something artificially. So like if I look at something through a telescope or a microscope or through like study, like like performing a study, like a trial, those are artificial ways of perceiving the world. And it tends to take you away from the symbolic understanding of something and vice versa. So, like, we exist in this world where there's material reality, but there's also spiritual reality. And here's where this connection idea comes in, or being true on multiple levels. For example, the human body is material, but it's also spiritual. So it's like we have a brain, but it's not our mind. It's not our life. It's like we have blood, it carries oxygen through us, through our bodies, feeding our cells, all things that they didn't know anciently. But like the life is in the blood, but they understood that in a different way than we do today. But it's not that it's not that it's obviously true. Um, so just in the same way that we are material, but we're also spiritual, it's like we have thought, we have like this realm, this intangible realm going on within us, but we're also like meat bags. And so it's the same with the world. It's like the world is earth, it's like matter, but it's also heaven. It's like this clear, light, intangible, unreachable thing you can't touch, but it affects the world. And then there's like degrees of like layers of reality between that and around us where that idea plays out in so many ways. Like I can't even describe it to you. It's like you just have to think about it and experience it. That is the only way to understand the spiritual view, to meditate on it. That's the best introduction I can give to that.